Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first UC Ag Expert Talk of 2021. My name is Cheryl Reynolds. I'm with the UC statewide IPM program. Peter Cosina is also with us. He'll be running our polls and troubleshooting any technical problems. And Peter and I are working from our homes, and this could affect the quality of our audio connection. Please note that today's webinar is targeted to growers and agricultural pest management professionals. Master gardeners can certainly benefit from participating, but the pest management methods presented, especially the pesticides, are not to be followed without a clear understanding of their legal use in home environments. And then here's a list of the topics that we've already covered in this webinar series. So you can go there to that playlist and view any that you might have missed or want to view again. All right, so now I'm going to introduce our speaker. We have Sonia Rios. She's an area subtropical horticultural advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Riverside County. And today she's speaking on current challenges for avocado weed management. So now we're going to pass this over to Sonia, and you can go ahead and share.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Cheryl. So my name is Sonia Rios. I am a subtropical horticulture farm advisor in Riverside in San Diego County. I see that on the poll, there was a lot of my SoCal growers and PCAs that I work with. That's really exciting. I'm glad that you guys tuned in and you're not tired of me talking about weeds yet. But I've been in this position now for a little over 6 years now. And I did work a lot with our weed specialist, Travis Bean, who has now passed. But we worked very closely on the project I'm about to show you guys, as well as work in citrus. But today we're going to focus on avocados. And a lot of people are like, well, why do you even do weed control? Aren't the trees big enough to shade out the weeds? And the mulch that is created from their leaf litter. Yes, that is true. However, that's a full functioning adult tree, and it takes many years for them to get that way. So in the meantime, you have to fight certain pests, and the biggest one that we would have to say would have to be weeds. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about integrated weed management, some weed biology, how to identify weeds, the most troublesome weeds that we see today, some tips for applying herbicides, and we're going to discuss glyphosate and what we're currently doing to search for alternatives. And that's going to be based on some research that was sponsored by the California Avocado Commission, and it's myself, Ben Faber from Ventura, and Peggy Mock from UCR, and Holog Bogovich from Ventura. So let me get started. So just going back to the basics, I did see that it looks like 50% of the people were experienced and 50% weren't. So we're just going to go really quick on, basic integrated weed management. And pretty much the goal is to design the most appropriate method in a variety of situations that ensure a sustainable ecological system and a minimum influence of nuisance weeds. And a lot of people ask, well, what is a weed? And most people are, oh, it's a dandelion. Oh, it's Bermuda grass. Well, actually, a weed can be any plant that's not supposed to be there. So a good example would be, let's say you're a row crop grower and you grow wheat 1 year, and the following season you're growing corn, but the wheat starts popping up. Guess what? You're going to have to tackle that as it being a weed. So it's basically a plant that's not supposed to be there. And when it comes to managing them, we usually have 4 components of a management plan, and it's physical, cultural, chemical, or biological. So when we started getting down to what are the strategies, biological, we don't see too much of that in weed science. There are maybe a couple of fungicide, fungi that can actually take over weeds, but that's still very experimental, and it doesn't have a high success rate. They're still working on it though. However, probably the most probably second runner up would probably have to be mechanical. You have your mowing and pruning, and then your burning. Cultural, the mulching is probably the most popular that I've seen, as well as chemical, which is pretty interesting for the fact that a lot of our groves are going into organic status. So chemicals can still be used, but they have to be certified organic, and that's going to be another challenge that we're going to be looking at, especially since a lot of people are trying to convert to the organic system. So I go back to, why do we control weeds? Besides the obvious fact that they reduce competition for especially younger trees, they compete for light, moisture, and nutrients. They can reduce yield quality and tree growth. That's particularly with the first couple of years when you first plant a tree. And they can serve as hosts for disease, vertebrates, and insects. The most common vertebrates, I would probably have to say, would be gophers. Gophers and squirrels, they actually enjoy the weedy habitat because it can actually hide them from all the hawks. So they have somewhere to go for safety. With my date palm growers, I really have to stress the weed growth because of rattlesnakes. When they're out in the Coachella Desert, there are about a handful of workers that do get bit because the vegetation is just so high, and that's a perfect place for snakes to go. Most of the time, it decreases land value. Nobody wants to purchase or actually invest in something that's not taken care of. It can be hazardous to humans, pests, and livestock. And it's just, not pleasing to look at. For a good example, like on the right side, I found this photo, and it's basically in Australia in 1907, they surveyed about 700 dead cattle from one day that died because of a poisonous weed. And so we really try to stress the growers that are near the foothills and that have cattle, because that's where they're usually grown, to look out for those. And then, of course, there's the seed bank. A lot of times when people do decide, okay, well, I'm going to get rid of these weeds, the timing is so crucial. You don't want to go out there when they're seeding, when they're adults, because guess what? When you start mowing or doing something, or even just simply walking through there, you're going to spread the seeds, and then you're going to create a seed bank there. And seeds live for a really long time. Sometimes it's also safety. If you see in the slide, they can, block signs. And I know Caltrans has been working on that, but sometimes, with budget cuts and just the vegetation just keeps on growing and they can't keep up, that can be dangerous. And then, of course, the biggest thing is the fire risk. It's basically fuel for fire to go through. And since we are in drought and we haven't had a lot of rain, there's a lot of vegetation that is building up. And unfortunately, we just don't create some of the defensible space that we should do. And if we don't take care of the weeds and just let the cycles go by and then it just dries there in the field, you're basically creating an environment for a fire to go up. Okay, so the key of fighting weeds is knowing the life cycle. That is probably key. You need to know what you're going to war with, pretty much. And knowing the species is very important. There is a UC Davis weed group that can actually help you identify weeds. I can help you identify them, or any other of the weed advisors, or even the agronomy farm advisors are also very very knowledgeable on weeds as well. And then you want to try to classify them. Okay, do these guys come up once a year, twice a year? Are they there year round? You want to know what form are they? Are they broadleaves? Are they grasses? Are they sedge? I'm going to get more into details on why that is very important. What type of leaf surface do they have? What kind of texture? Do they have a waxy cuticle? That's going to determine how you will be applying any herbicides if that's the route you want to go. Then the growth and development. How tall does this plant usually get? Do you know the plant maturity? What it does, how it produces and lets go of seed, how it responds during stress. And then, of course, you want to know what species it is, because there are actually some species that are more susceptible to become herbicide resistant. Some ones right off the top of my head, we have horseweed, fleabane. They're infamous to becoming herbicide resistant. Palmer, amaranth will probably be a second one that's probably there. But it's very, very important that you know what exactly you have. And another thing that I really stress is you actually want to scout by foot. You want to get out of the truck and actually go and walk the grove. Maybe one little problem, one plant can explode into a huge problem. So you want to try to take care of even those single plants that may have gotten away from the spray or may not have gotten cut, because that's still a risk of it producing seed. And an obvious time is when it gets done raining. Weeds will just take off from there. You have about a good 2, maybe 3 days to get out there and try to control them, unless you knew it was going to rain and then you put down a pre-emergent, which is applied to the soil and it prevents the seeds from coming up. Or let's say you do any type of soil disturbance. Probably the biggest thing that I see that people just don't think about too is when they are cleaning up around their grove, they take the tractor and then they till to try to clean up the area. Once you disturb the soil, you're actually bringing up the seeds back up. So any type of moisture that does happen, those weeds are just going to take off. So make sure that you treat those parts of the grove that don't necessarily have the trees in them as well. So on there. So we're going to talk about perennials. These guys are probably the most difficult weeds that you're going to encounter. They will produce foliage, seed, and reach maturity each year, and they live more than 2 years. The reason why they are so hard to control is because they have rhizomes, tubers, and stamens. And that makes it so much harder, because even if you hand weed or if you go out there with a hula hoe and you don't completely take out that root system, guess what? It's just going to come right back up. And it's really hard to tell whether you got the whole plant or not, because the roots are beneath the ground and you can't see if you pulled out the whole plant. And usually when plants become distressed because you are trying to kill them, then they'll send out a signal to grow faster. So that's why it's very hard to get rid of these plants. For probably the most common ones you'll probably see is dandelion. That is a weed that can spread that way. Field bindweed, that's why that one's almost impossible to get rid of. Like I said, if you even leave a little broken piece of that root, guess what? It's going to come right back up. So perennials are pretty difficult. The ones that come up once a year, these have a 1-year life cycle. For instance, Palmer Amaranth is probably a really good example. Usually the 1-year weeds are prolific seed producers. They produce hundreds of thousands of seeds for one plant. And that what makes it difficult to control. And because, especially our weather down here in Southern California, the weather is perfect almost all year long for weeds. And that's quite a challenge as well. And usually we have winter and summer weeds. Winter weeds could be your hairy fleabane, horse weeds. Summer can also be your Palmer. Biennial. These guys require 2 seasons for completion of a life cycle. The first year, they develop a heavy root system and low-growing leaves. The second year, the flowers set, seed, and matures. Mullein and most of the thistles usually land in this category for that. They usually produce a radial cluster, most like like a rosette. That's where the thistles have on top. And from what I heard, they say the easiest way to control thistle that land in this category is by removing the rosette, basically mowing or chopping by the first year that you see them. So I'm sure everyone in this group is very familiar with these two. You find them all over the state. They don't discriminate which cropping system you have, but we have to our left, we have hairy fleabane, and then to the right, we have horseweed, which some people call mare's tail. They're both from the same family. They're both coniazes, and that's what makes them so difficult to control. So how to tell the difference? Well, horseweed and hairy fleabane plants are difficult to distinguish from each other until they're about the 12-leaf stage. Once the plant bolts is a way of saying how they grow, because usually some weeds, they spread out when they grow. These guys go straight up. That's what bolting is. It is easy to tell which is which. When the horseweed bolts, you see the horseweeds on the bottom. It sends up a single or primary vegetative stem that is erect with dark green leaves that are 4 inches long and are crowded together with an alternate arrangement that's on the stem. The stem is either smooth or covered with shaggy gray hairs. And then as you see the fleabane on the top, it kind of has some of these little like ridges on it. But still, even I still have problems. When I go out to the field and there's a population of both, I really have to sit and think about which is which. And then hairy fleabane, unlike horseweed, develops multiple lateral branches without a central stem, and has leaves that are much more narrow with rigid hairs. The distance between leaves is greater in hairy fleabane than it is in horseweed. Also, a really good way to tell is that if you do have a mature species, horseweed can get up to 10 feet tall. They can get as tall as I am, if not way taller. Whereas hairy fleabane usually doesn't go past 3 feet. Horseweed and fleabane seeds, they cannot survive more than 3 years in the field condition. So it is possible to get this plant in check if you do have it within your grove. You just have to really be on top of it. And like I said, the most crucial part, especially for hairy fleabane and horseweed, you want to try to get them before they seed. They're almost like dandelions. You know how you can blow a dandelion and all the little seeds go all over the place? That's how these guys spread. Even just walking past them with your jeans can distribute seeds all over the place. So you want to get that before it seeds out. And then we're going to just talk about in general. I'm going to go a little bit faster now because we're running short on time. But there's two things that we have to consider in our groves when we are dealing with weed management. And then the first huge problem is the diverse growing conditions. You have Ventura, you have San Luis Obispo, you have San Diego. There's so many different growing conditions, so many different soil types. So many different cultivation practices. Are you organic? Are you conventional? There's not one size fits all when it comes to chemical control, which is the number one way that people control weeds. And then the second problem is if we do decide to use chemicals, we usually don't hop around the chemistries like we should. When you use a single mode of action, that's the herbicide chemistry, it can create herbicide resistant weeds. For example, the most popular is glyphosate. Usually it takes about 5 to 8 years for a resistant population to really take over. And that's if you use the same chemistry continuously. Getting a little bit more into the first problem with the diverse growing condition. Some people are limited. You have to kind of do your weed control with what you have. What resources do you have financially? Can you afford to be switching herbicides? Can you afford to get that equipment? And then environmental. Most of the groves are on steep slopes. Maybe you can't get your quad down there, or you can't. You have to hand spray. By spot spraying because you can't get the equipment through. There's a lot of practical limitations, and it's all based on what the grower can afford and their situation. And like I said, I have noticed that organic groves, there are becoming more and more, and they are the biggest challenge when it comes to weed management, just for the fact that there's a lack of available herbicide chemistries. And there is a lot of research being done, and there are some people that use mulches. That's a great start. In addition to suppressing weed seeds, it can also help retain water. Just make sure you don't want to get too much mulch around the bark. And if you do decide to not use chemical, you have to obviously do it physically. And a lot of people use weed whackers. Well, be careful when you do use those weed whackers, because if you see in this photo up here, this tree just got hammered by a weed whacker, and that can become susceptible to Phytophthora. And then you have a whole second problem to deal with. So, and like I said, most organic growers work on a smaller scale, and they simply just cannot afford the weed management, because especially down in San Diego, we get a lot of invasive pests. So it seems like most of the resources go towards keeping that in check. That when we first had the shot hole borer, and then now we have the lace bug that's coming up now. There's a lot of things that kind of push weed management to the back of the burner. So the biggest thing I would have to tell you is prevention. I know that's easy for me to say, because a lot of the times, most people that want to grow the avocados, they buy land that was already been planted or has already been used. So one, you may not have the history of what was going on prior to you buying the property. So the seed bank is already established, because you have the mature trees there. But if you're going to be planting new trees, you have a really good chance to get a head start on that weed bank. And in weed science, we always say prevention is better than the control. But control is required because weeds arrive without a notice, and therefore they can be prevented. So when it comes to prevention and eradication, that requires a long-term plan. You just can't go driving around and be like, oh, I see some weeds, so I'm just going to spray some Roundup. No, you got to have a plan for it. Maybe next time there's a certain weed in a pre-emergent works really well. Maybe you want to apply a pre-emergent so you can reduce the amount of post-emergent that you are applying. And that also brings in different chemistries, which can help reduce the chances of the population becoming resistant. And this also seems to be the most cost-effective method as well. More on the prevention side, entails the use of such practice as sanitation, spot spraying, or hand labor to prevent the source of weed infestation. And when I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, because when I say sanitation, a lot of the times when you have a few minor weeds, it's not a huge problem, but you drive a quad through there, you walk through them, well, guess what? You're basically carrying the seeds with you. And if you go to a different grove or a different part of the field, then most likely you'll be spreading seeds that way. So that's one way. And then spot spraying, like I said, even one can cause a problem. And the biggest thing that I've also seen is a lot of weeds, when you hand pull them, some of them kick into survival mode, will actually replant their roots into the ground and go into immediate seeding. We don't see that as much, but it is really possible. And that's why we really suggest the sanitation part. Once you're done weeding, if you can take the weeds out of the grove, that would be a lot better, and then reduce the chances of the plant resetting its weeds in. And then we talk about ground cover. This is not a new concept, but is now becoming something that more growers are looking into. Chris Sayer, he is a grower out in Ventura, and he's huge on this, and he's had a lot of good success with this, and it's ground cover. There's a lot of positive things about it, and it was really difficult for me to accept any type of ground cover, which can include cover crops, just for the fact, I came from the agronomy side, and we don't like to see no weeds at all. So we like to see it bare. But here in Southern California, where we don't get that much water, and most of these trees are on hills, you want to try to prevent some soil erosion. You want to try to keep some of that water in, especially when the trees are younger. Ground cover has been known to work. Established trees, you want to get that ground cover rotated every few years to avoid pathogen buildup. And also, one thing that I have to warn about, if you do decide to use any type of ground cover, it can be a frost hazard. The floor experience cooler temperatures than they do with bare floors. The temperature can actually be 3 to 5 degrees cooler, and especially with these plants being so sensitive, they could get hit with it. So that's something to think about. Currently, there is no cover crop species that will fit all situations. They're still doing a lot of testing. It takes a few years to get it, and then just to get a grower to be able to cooperate, because we have to see how it works within the field. There's not much greenhouse work that we can actually do on this. We actually have to see it done. Just some really quick tips on if you do decide to use chemical control. Remember, like I said, you want to make sure you're using the proper herbicides. And the way to make sure you're using the proper herbicides is, what are you going up against? Are they broadleaves or are they grasses? Because you have non-selective herbicides and selective herbicides to actually have to choose from. Some only go for grasses, some only do broadleaves, some have a large spectrum and kill whatever it touches. And then you also want to think about the different type of chemistries. And then you have the proper placement of the material. Is it a direct spray? Do you want to make sure you get that 100% coverage? And from one nozzle should reach to the middle of the spray pattern, of the adjacent nozzle, just like here in this picture. You want to make sure that they are overlapping to a certain degree, because if not, you start getting into this gray area where it may or may not get sprayed. Remember when I was saying when you do use chemical control, you want to make sure you try to hit down the entire population for that, and then you want to pick a fan angle and pressure that achieves this, and lower the boom, the better for that. Proper herbicide rate. Too much doesn't always mean that it's going to work or it's going to do better. There's always a saturation point to which how much the plant can actually absorb. So if you put more than you think it actually needs, then you're just wasting product. Product is expensive, then you waste money, then you waste time. So don't go down that route. Always follow the labeled rate. Then there's proper equipment. PSI gauge. I saw one grower going out there with just a hand pump with Roundup in it, and he had a dense population, and he wasn't knowing how much he was really putting on. He didn't get the correct coverage, so of course it didn't work as well. So you want to make sure that your equipment is calibrated. You want to make sure that you have it, and also you want it properly cleaned after each use. I cannot stress how many times I've gone out to a field and seen damage from the tank not being cleaned correctly. Let's say the grower used paraquat, and then he cleaned the tank but didn't clean it well enough, and then he added Roundup in there and he used it as if he was using Roundup. But guess what? You just contaminated your tank when it's not cleaned properly. So you can see damage from the previous herbicide that you used. And then proper timing. Are the weeds as tall as me? If they are, most likely you're not going to get the coverage, or you're not going to get the success rate that you want. Usually you want to hit them when they're 6 inches or even smaller. Also, if you are going through a drought and there's like a patch there that hasn't gotten water, but it's still growing, those plants will probably be water stressed. And usually when weeds get water stressed, they usually try to save all their moisture and they close their stomata. So if you're trying to use a systemic herbicide that's supposed to go through the entire weed and it goes in through the stomata, it's not going to work because they're going to be closed. So nothing can get into the plant, nothing will kill it. Also, the time of day is also very important. Expect that the surface temperature inversions will form as sunset approaches and will likely persist throughout the night and also during sunrise on many occasions. And we can get into some trouble with the inversion layers with that because the chemical can actually move and cause a drift problem. Then there's make sure that you apply it correctly. Are you using a CO2 sprayer, using a backpack? Once again, we get into what time do you want to apply? And then you actually don't want to try to go fast. You want to actually try to keep a slow and steady timing when you are going with the backpack sprayer, walking, or with your quad. And please read the label. I cannot stress that enough. Reading the label is very, very important. Okay, and when you do use chemicals, they can fail. There's a lot of reasons why they can fail. A lot of time it has to do with environmental things, maybe the type of soil that you have. Leaching can occur, which is a possibility when it comes to avocados, just for the fact that they do like some sandy soil and something. God, what's that chemical called? I can't think of it right now. Can't think of it right now, but there's one chemical that's used as a pre-emergent, and it can leach if it's not used correctly. And of course, it doesn't help that most of these trees are on slopes. So that can also cause a drift to happen. The wind, is also another thing. Unfortunately, it's like it has to be the perfect timing, the perfect environment in order for you to hit that window for you to spray. So it starts getting a little complicated. Probably the biggest thing is temperature. Temperature can affect the way a plant grows, the rate that it grows. So let's say you go out there on Friday and you see a weed at the 4-leaf stage. Oh, I'll just go ahead and come back and get that on Monday or Tuesday. You come back on Tuesday, it's now a foot tall. It's just the weather conditions have to do a lot with how the weeds develop. And then the younger they are, the most likely they have less cuticle development there. They don't become as waxy. And when they are well watered, when it's not as hot, it's easier for the herbicide to translocate, to move within the actual weed. And then, of course, then you get into the volatilization and the degradation. That is something that when I worked as an SRA in Tulare County, we actually, it was winter and we were spraying like Roundup and something else in a wheat field. And we did it like at 6 in the morning. It was still very cold and foggy. And when we went out there to go rate a week later, nothing happened. It's because it drifted all into the next field. So I learned the hard way on how that can happen. We just, we had to spray it this day. So it's kind of like all or nothing, but we wasted our time and the money because it ended up just going to the next field. It just drifted over. So that was kind of embarrassing. And also I kind of mentioned this already about how the guard cells, how when there's plenty of water to the weeds, they're open. So when you put in a systemic, it goes through the entire plant because there's water available, because it goes through the phloem. If you have dry soil going through a drought, they're going to close. So if you spray the herbicide, it's not going to go in because the plant is starting to shut down to protect the moisture. And it's also another thing too. This is like 50-50. I was taught that if you chop the weeds and then go immediately and spray, then the weeds will not die. Just for the fact that if it is, for instance, if it is a systemic, you need the herbicide to go through the phloem, and it goes up and comes down. If you chop off the top, it has nowhere to go. And one thing that could probably happen too is that once it's chopped, the weed can start stressing out and then just go into productive mode. So, there's a couple of things to think about, but usually I would suggest, you try to hit them before they even get that tall. Okay. And then sometimes we're like, well, how come it just doesn't work or the herbicide doesn't go in? There's a lot of things to consider when you're dealing with herbicides. There's a difference in leaf shape and structure. If you're dealing with grasses, you don't have that much surface space. So you need finer drops to actually get it to do that. Then there's extensive leaf cuticle and wax. Then the trichomes, which are the hairs that some of the leaves have. Also, when you mix your chemicals, there could be dust or organic compounds mixed in the water. So when we're in that situation, we usually deal with adjuvants, and these can help. Like, I've used them and I have not used them. So it's really what you can afford, what you can deal with. It is highly recommended that you use one of these because its two main functions of it is to help you apply the herbicide, and it also increases the potency by increasing adhesion to the actual plant and help with translocation. We have formulation and spray adjuvants, and usually the formulations, these are included within the formulated herbicide product by the manufacturer. So sometimes you guys will see, I don't know, try to think here, maybe safofinasil Trevex, you're going to need something additional to it that that the chemical company recommends that you use specifically for that. And then you just have the spray ones, which can go into any type of herbicide, and those are added to the tank mix. Usually, they help by reducing drift, reducing foam when you're loading it up into the spray unit. So those are very, very useful and can make a difference. There are numerous types of adjuvants. Usually, they're penetrates, drift inhibitors, which I was talking about. They reduce the droplet and also thickens the solution as well. And then the anti-foaming, those help with the air gaps when you're filling up the tank. It pops all the little bubbles that can actually cause the herbicide to not be applied correctly. So then we have weed shifts. Basically, weed shifts is that once you control one weed, you're like, yes, I finally got this weed. Well, guess what? That first weed was probably suppressing another population. So then you have a new population coming up. So that's also something that you can run into because you don't know what's in the seed bank. And then when it comes to how long weed seeds last, just take a look at this chart. Burr clover and cheeseweed can last for up to 200 years within the soil without being disturbed. So let's say you have a plant that comes right up like fleabane, and you finally get rid of your fleabane, you do your tilling, you do all sorts of stuff. Guess what? You're tilling back up these weeds that were being suppressed from the first one. And because weeds can last a really long time, you're going to have a hard time controlling the population. And then, of course, guess what herbicide I'm talking about here? We all love it. We all use it, but we all know there's been some controversy with it. Glyphosate, that is correct. Why do we use it? Why do we love it so much? First of all, it's cheap. There are so many different formulations of it. It actually has a very low toxicity level. And actually vinegar at a higher rate can actually be more harmful to people. And like I said, remember, once we get into toxology, which I should probably do a talk on that, dose equals the response. So obviously when more of something is going to affect you, and it also absorbs into the soil and then it becomes inactive. So since it is a contact, it's not going to be a pre-emergent. It's not going to sit there within the soil because it has a really short half-life, which is 50 days, which is really, really short for a pesticide. And then also you can obviously use it for the cotton, corn, and soybeans because they are glyphosate resistant. So a lot of growers do take advantage of that and purposely plant those genetically modified plants so that they can use glyphosate. Here is just a really quick map of the United States of how many glyphosate resistant weeds there are in each state. In California currently, we have 7. When I started Weed Science about 7-8 years ago, there was only 5. So we've had 2 more since then. And then if you look down where Mississippi's at, where all the cotton, corn is grown, most likely it's genetically modified, they're going to use Roundup. And guess what? They have the most problems. And most of the herbicide resistant problems happened in the southeast. And we learned from their lessons. But because we have such a diverse growing community in California, we can't help but it actually happening. And here in California, we have the bluegrass hairy fleabane, horseweed, which, by the way, those 2 up in the San Joaquin Valley are actually dual resistant to paraquat as well. Our Southern California populations have not been officially tested, but we have a high suspicion that they are most likely glyphosate resistant. Then we have Italian ryegrass, jungle rice, pomeramarant, and rigid ryegrass. And as you can see here, here we have the regular herbicides, and then I believe Roundup was invented in 1974. So if you take a look at when the chart starts going up, it happened right after glyphosate was actually invented. So since then, the cases have just been incredible. And most people are like, well, how does herbicide resistance happen? Well, it's just as simple as this chart. So let's say you're out there spraying. By natural selection, nature will always have a plant that will be resistant to whatever you give it. We don't know why it happens, genetics, whatever it happens. There will be something that will be automatically resistant to it. So if you spray, don't go back with the second mode of action, or don't go back and hand weed and don't double check your work, you're going to have that one plant survive. Yeah, you're probably thinking, yeah, no big deal. Well, that one plant produces its offspring, which have that genetic makeup of surviving whatever herbicide you applied. So the following season, guess what? Those seeds are going to grow up to be adult plants. Yeah, okay, well, not too bad. You have a few. Eventually, within 5 to 7 years, your whole population will actually shift to become resistant, and that's when you're going to have the problem. And there's actually different type of herbicide resistant rates. And the first one is obviously you're single when you're resistant to only one herbicide. Then there's cross herbicide resistance, which is 2 or more herbicides with the same mode of action. And then multiple herbicide resistance, which is resistance to 2 or more herbicides with different modes of action. How am I doing on time, Peter? Okay. And then we have, of course, the other big problem is the lack of chemistries. Once we start getting into the specialty crops, they start to narrow down. As you can see here, these are the crops that I work with. For the avocado, the N means you can only apply it when it's non-bearing. And the R's, the N means it's restricted. You cannot use it. There's a lot of N's on here. And B means you can use it when they are non-bearing. For the avocados and dates, you don't have very much of a choice. In citrus, there's a little bit more wiggle room for that. So a lot of growers are even kind of forced to use the same modes of action because there really isn't nothing that's registered for it. And that goes to the project that I told you about that we're currently working on. We have a site in Santa Paula and a site in Riverside. And we actually took what growers are using in citrus, and we're going to try to apply them to the avocado trees and see how they react. So we're looking at not so much the weed population, whether they work or not, because we have background on what those chemistries can do with certain weeds. It's the phytotoxicity that we're looking at. If there's phytotoxicity, will they eventually just grow out of it? It's just temporary, or will it like really sabotage what you have? So here are the chemicals that we did use. Sorry, I'm going through this really fast. This is 1 week after treatment with the pre-emergent. We don't really expect to see much because it is a pre-emergent. It goes in the soil and it's systemic and it works slowly. So obviously in 1 week, we're not going to see anything. 1 week again. Allion actually did really good for like just being 1 week. And then we have the post-emergent. This is where we're supposed to actually see it burn down. Forfeit 280, which I believe is Rely, did fairly well. Glyphosate actually did well. Intensity not as well. And then with Suppress, I was surprised it didn't work better. However, with Suppress, it's a little tricky. You really need to read the guidelines on that because it always has to be constantly mixed and agitated and can't sit for very long, or else it won't work correctly. So I had to make sure during the second rounds that we do it that I asked the person to spray to make sure that it's constantly being moved so that it works. And then what we're really looking at is the damage to it. So here we have the post-emergent. Gallery did some damage. Matrix, believe it or not, didn't. And then how we determined this is we tied off a part of the branch and then we purposely sprayed it. So the whole thing was drenched in the herbicide. And then after a week, this is what most of the damage looked like. So far, it looked pretty good. Post-emergence, the Chateau Allion did a quick job, but it also did cause some burning. Post-emergent 1 week. Forfeit, the Rely 280, it obviously did some damage. Look what glyphosate did. And then here we have 1 month later, we have the post, Forfeit, Intensity, Suppress, Glyphosate was still very clear. So Rely 280 and glyphosate were still clear after a month. For the pre-emergence, I don't know why it didn't work as well as we wanted it to be. We did have a lot of irrigation go on, and it wasn't really monitored at this site. So maybe that had something to do with it. But once again, regardless, Halion still worked very, very well with it. Okay, pre-emergent damage, one about a month and a half almost. We don't really see damage. Simazine didn't even do anything, really. Goaltender didn't really do anything either, as you compare to the untreated. 1 month post, okay, this is where we saw a lot of the damage. So Rely 280, obviously, this is what it did. It was one of the best herbicides to clean up the floor, but at the same time, like glyphosate, it just killed the plant. Intensity, it did okay. Suppress, obviously, it didn't do that much damage. And if it did, there's these little holes here, but then it recovered right back up fairly quickly. So with the results of what our first year's data, we're actually, I think we're just wrapping up the second trial. So once we get all this data collected, we're going to have a better idea of how to approach the situation. And maybe the next thing we're going to be doing are tank mixes to see how we can do different tank mixes to try to avoid using glyphosate, because it is kind of scary that we may not be able to have it anymore, especially with all the things that are happening. So we need to be prepared. So basically, the two herbicides that had the greatest phytotoxicity damage was glufosinate and glyphosate. However, they actually worked the best. They had the cleanest plots, almost to a 95 to 100% control by the 8 weeks in both seasons. In the fall treatment, for some reason, they caused a little bit more damage to the tree foliage. That could just be the season that it happened in. For the spring, we noticed that glufosinate caused damage at the 2 weeks after treatment, followed by Prowl, pendimethalin, isoxaben, and saflofinacil, which is Trevex, by 8 weeks. However, by the 8 weeks, the injury level on the glufosinate treatment subsided substantially. And myself and Peggy Mock did 2 different trials, actually did 4, and it was to try to get glufosinate Rely 280 registered for the avocados. And I did see some damage initially, and they matched up fairly closely to our results. Eventually, they did grow out of the damage by I think like 2 months or so. So that's about 8 weeks. So it matches up closely to this. So hopefully we can get glufosinate on our roster pretty soon. And as a flam, it also gave excellent weed control within the fall and in the spring, with some minor damage in the first couple of weeks. However, by the 8 weeks, there was minimal visible leaf damage. So that could be another candidate. Rimsulfuron, that is Matrix. That one had exceptional weed control in both the spring and fall throughout the 8 weeks, and had little to no injury to the tree leaves. So based on our in-progress results, Indaziflam and Rimsulfuron may provide excellent weed control, similar to glyphosate and glufosinate, but greatly increase safety in bearing avocados. So just in general, just what we went over, we went through a lot, and you guys did really good on the quizzes, but remember to be practicing weed management in general. You want to try to use as many different resources as you can. Design the most appropriate method for your situation. You want to make sure you get out there and actually scout by foot. You want to try to catch those escapes that didn't die during your spraying or mowing. And remember, weeds emerge throughout all growing seasons. Just because they are technically a weed or a spring or or summer weed, with the climate changing, they're just all over the board, especially in Southern California. So don't really go based on that. You have to actually see what's out there. And remember that not one size fits all. You have to create your own weed management plan based on your growing conditions, on your resources. And when you do create that, you don't want to use the same mode of action. You want to start switching around chemistries. And I know that's hard for me to say, but hopefully with this research that we're coming up with, we can get some new products registered for this commodity, so we can start switching around chemistries, because we want to try to stay away from glyphosate. Okay, questions.
All right. So this first one is about solarization. Is solarization recommended pre-plant or post-plant in groves planted with avocado trees?
Pre-plant. Definitely want to do it pre-plant, because the way that solarization works, you want to get the soil prepped and ready before you put in those trees. Once you have the trees in, it's a little difficult to do the solarization, just for the fact that you're going to need more time and more manpower to put the plastic on, or whichever type of material that you decide to use. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next one was, did the suppressed treatment on the foliage at 9% have agitation issues? He was surprised to see that there was no phytotoxicity.
Yes, that's actually what we suspected, because I've used suppress before, and it usually, the first few weeks it nails it. I'm not sure what happened. When we spoke to the Ventura site, theirs worked a little more closely to what we expected. So that's why we have two different sites. So it was able to take both sites and determine that percentage that way. But I have to take a look at the second year's data, which they're putting in right now, to see how it did this time around, because I know we had problems. We had a couple of hiccups the first time that we did spray. So yeah, technically suppress at 9% would usually do a little bit more damage, especially because we caught it at the right stage as well. So that's something that we're really going to have to look at within our data.
Okay. The next one, were some of the poor results on Matrix due to the type of weed it targets? And then they said, I think that's why we use combos in citrus.
That is actually something that we were thinking about, because like I said, usually when it comes to Matrix, it does have some post emergent in it, and we thought we'd expect to see more in the Ventura rate. It just nailed it completely. Like I said, for some reason I expect to see more with the pre-emergence at our site. The weeds that we had present were fleabane, lamb's quarter, malva, which are kind of the tougher ones to try to get. And I could see why we would just tank mix it. But I think eventually we're going to get there with the tank mixing. Right now, we just basically need to see if the basic chemistry line, will it cause damage? Yes or no? Pretty much that's what we're doing, just to give you an option so that you can potentially tank mix it. And I remember, if I remember correctly from grad school, I did work with Trevex and Matrix quite a bit. And if you mixed it with glyphosate, with Roundup, it actually had some antagonism, and the herbicide actually worked better by itself on some particular weeds versus them in a combo. So, there's a lot of debate about that, but I could see where they're coming from when they say we do that in citrus. There's all sorts of mixtures that they have.
Okay. In Southern California, is mare's tail necessarily glyphosate resistant, or is it just tougher to penetrate because of hairs? When very young, glyphosate can usually kill mare's tail.
Yes, absolutely. It could be both. But most of the time when people do try to hit mare's tail, you have to hit it at the right stage. If it's more than 6, 7 inches, most likely you're just going to kill half of it, which can also be a problem because you can create a tolerance to the herbicide. And once you create a tolerance, it can eventually turn into resistance. And remember, when we're talking about different populations, you said they were from San Diego, Southern California. Okay,
Yeah,
this is
Southern
okay.
California.
There are different populations that have different genetics within Southern California. Like for instance, most likely there's glyphosate resistance in the Coachella Valley because they have row crops with GMO glyphosate resistant crops. So the likelihood of them getting resistance is a lot higher than us getting it in, I don't know, in Temecula or something. And it just really depends on the population, because the populations is what controls the genetic diversity. And for instance, hairy fleabane or mare's tail, it is dual resistant to paraquat and Roundup in Tulare, but it's not in Bakersfield, so it kind of depends on where the populations go. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any chance of a special use label for glyphosate ammonium for use in avocado, potential glyphosate resistance?
Yes. Myself and Peggy Mock were doing studies the last 4 years on that. And the IR4 program that we are working with right now, that's supposed to do their job. And they split the work between California and another state. I want to say Florida or Puerto Rico within the avocados. And our work looked pretty promising. So basically we did our part. So now we're just waiting for the government or DPR to do their part in getting that special use until we get it permanently put on the label. So that's in the works as we speak.
Okay. How do you explain the delayed reaction to forfeit, which is supposed to be more of a contact herbicide?
Good question. I don't know. I would thought, yeah, like I said, I was quite surprised forfeit didn't work as strong. I believe those pictures were from the fall trial. During the spring trial, it actually worked a little bit better, but I think also for the fact because during the winter, the leaves tend to harden off a little bit versus the spring when they have their new leaves coming out. So they're a little bit more tender and a little bit more susceptible. So I think the timing had something to do with it. I believe the photos that I took, those were from the fall. So like I said, and then there's Ventura's site as well. So we're going to take the average of both, but that's just what I saw in Riverside. So very likely, it's going to get tested 2 more times. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. And the next one is how to treat Bermuda grass.
Bermuda grass, that has rhizomes. And remember what I said about rhizomes? It's almost impossible to get rid of because if you don't get the whole plant or the whole weed system, it's not going to work. There are some selective herbicides that are out there that just hit grasses because if it's in a row crop or if it's in your yard, you don't want to use a broad spectrum like Roundup because it will kill whatever it touches. You want to go towards a selective grass killer that just kills grasses only, or that particular one. And with that one, I would really have to look at the labels. I have a couple in mind, but I don't want to give out the wrong information because I don't really deal with Bermuda grass that much. But if you go to the UC IPM guidelines that are online, you can go where the avocados are at and it should tell you which herbicides are registered, how to apply it, and how much to apply. So that's a really good resource as well for that. But I can't give you, any recommendations off the top of my head right now. But that will be a challenge.
Okay, and then one more just came in. Is there a specific rotational sequence to avoid and a sequence to strive for?
For avocados, let me see here. Usually what I've seen a lot of people do is simazine, now that I remember that you reminded me, I've seen people use simazine as the pre-emergent in the fall. So when they get towards the end of winter, you have a little bit of growth. That's when you would hit it with a post-emergent. Most likely you'll probably use glyphosate. And then you want to apply another pre-emergent, which can also be simazine, but it's a lot harder for those to become resistant than the glyphosate. Then you put a pre-emergent down. Again, that takes care of the beginning of the spring. And then before summer hits, you hit it with the post-emergent. So it's like 2 and 2, and the best time to put it on the pre-emergent is during the fall when it's raining, and during the spring when it's raining, supposedly. But one, a lot of people have problems because pre-emergents do actually cost more, and two is they actually are harder to apply just for the fact that you need some type of water to get them going. And if you put them on and if it doesn't rain for 2 weeks, guess what? You wasted your time and money, because when you applied it, it's not being incorporated correctly. So timing is also really important with that. And for our trial, what we did, because we did have pre-emergence, we actually had to move the sprinkler systems out to the middle rows to make sure that it got incorporated. But if you have a lot of trees and a lot of land, that, that's almost impossible to do. So it's becoming more of a challenge to actually have a rotation of chemicals and a cycle going, because it really depends on the weather, and our weather has just been off the wall. So it's getting a lot harder to pinpoint, I guess, a type of system now. So basically you have to go based on what resources you have, where you're at within the state, what the climate is, and try to do it that way. But traditionally, that's how it's always been.
I think we have gotten through everything. So thank you, Sonia, for presenting today. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Okay, thank you.
I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.